Saren Voss had been standing in front of the Alpha King for exactly 9 heartbeats, when every wolf in the throne room dropped to their knees. She had not meant to do it. She had not known she could. One moment, she was walking up the long marble aisle of the Dunmerran court, barefoot, according to tradition, her chin lifted the way her mother had taught her before the war took everything. And the next moment, the air in the room changed. It started with a sound, not a sound anyone could hear with their ears, but something deeper, something felt in the bones and blood. A pressure, a hush that rolled outward from where she stood like a stone dropped into still water. 300 wolves filled the throne room. Nobles, commanders, guards lining the walls with swords at their hips and teeth too sharp for human mouths. They had all come to see the treaty bride from the conquered territory of Ashenmere. Saren felt their gazes the moment the doors opened, hundreds of them, landing on her like physical weight. Some carried contempt, some carried pity, a few carried something hungrier. The aisle stretched forever, and at the far end of it, elevated on a dais of black stone, sat Alpha King Theron Mael. He was not what she had expected. The rumors described a brute, a warlord who had unified the northern territories through blood and brilliance. She had imagined someone monstrous. Instead, the man on the throne looked carved from granite and silence. Dark hair, a jaw set hard, and eyes the color of winter storms, gray and deep and utterly cold. He watched her approach without expression. His gaze moved over her and then past her, already dismissing her before she had reached the base of the dais. It stung more than it should have. Saren stopped where she had been instructed to stop, 3 paces from the bottom step, and lowered herself into the bow she had been taught. Chin down, palms open, throat exposed, submission posture. Every wolf in the room would read it instinctively, and every human in her would hate it. She rose slowly and met the king's gaze. Nothing happened. His face did not change. He did not speak. Then, from the left side of the room, someone laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound that cracked through the silence, like a stone through glass. A wolf in the second row of seats, broad-shouldered and golden-haired, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and grinned at her with teeth that were too long. "This is the offering," he said, loud enough for the entire chamber to hear. "A runt with no wolf and no bloodline. The Ashenmere people must truly be broken, if this is the best they can produce." The laughter spread. Not everywhere, not from everyone, but enough. Saren felt the heat rush up her neck and into her face. Her hands trembled at her sides. The golden-haired wolf stood. He was enormous, easily a head taller than any man she had known, and when he moved toward the aisle, the crowd parted for him with the practiced ease of people who knew better than to stand in his way. "Lord Haskell," someone hissed from the front row. "Sit down." He did not sit down. He walked toward Saren with the lazy confidence of a predator who knew his prey could not run. He stopped 2 feet in front of her and inhaled deeply, scenting her the way wolves did, openly, invasively, like she was meat on a butcher's table. "She smells like nothing," Haskell announced. "No wolf, no power, just fear and human sweat." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to something intimate and cruel. "You poor thing. Do you even know what happens to human brides in wolf courts?" Saren's pulse hammered in her ears. The king watched, though she could not read him, could not tell if he would intervene or if this was some kind of test she was expected to endure. Then Haskell reached for her. His hand closed around her upper arm and something inside Saren broke open. It was not a decision. It was not conscious thought. It was closer to an explosion, a force locked behind a door, her entire life, and now, under the pressure of fear and fury, and 300 wolves staring at her like she was already dead, the door shattered. The quiet hit the room like a shockwave. That was the only word Saren would ever find for it. Afterward, the quiet, because that is what it did. Every wolf in the throne room went silent, not just vocally silent, their wolves went silent. The animal inside each of them, the second heartbeat, the instinct and fury and power that defined their kind, was simply snuffed out. Haskell's hand flew off her arm like he had been burned. He staggered backward, his legs buckling, and hit the marble floor on both knees, gasping, clutching at his own chest like something had been stolen from him. Across the chamber, wolves crumpled. Some caught themselves on the edges of their seats. Some went down hard. A guard by the door dropped his sword with a clatter in the sudden silence. And on the dais King Theron Mael gripped the arms of his throne with white-knuckled hands, his jaw locked, his storm-gray eyes wide and fixed on Saren with an expression she could not name. The quiet lasted 7 seconds. Then it released, whatever it was, and the room erupted. Wolves surged to their feet, shouting, snarling, some half-shifting in panic. Haskell scrambled backward on the floor. The color drained from him, pointing at her with a shaking hand. "Witch," he spat. "She is a witch." Saren stood in the middle of the chaos, her heart slamming against her ribs, her hands trembling so badly, she pressed them against her thighs to hide it. She had no idea what she had done. The king rose from his throne. The room fell silent immediately. Not the unnatural silence she had somehow created, but the ordinary terrified silence of wolves, who knew better than to speak when their alpha stood. Theron descended the 3 steps from the dais, slowly, deliberately, his gaze never leaving hers. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He was taller than Haskell broader. And up close, the controlled power radiating from him was suffocating. He studied her face for a long, suspended moment. Then he turned to the dark-haired man standing at the foot of the dais. His beta, she would later learn. A wolf named Brennick, whose face betrayed nothing. "Clear the room," Theron said. His voice was low and even, and completely without inflection, which somehow made it more terrifying than any shout. Brennick moved instantly. Guards began ushering people toward the doors. The noise rose and fell as the crowd filtered out, casting looks over their shoulders at the human girl standing alone in the center of the throne room. Saren did not move. She could not. The king was still looking at her, and his expression had changed. The cold indifference was gone. What replaced it was something far more dangerous. Interest. The throne room emptied. The doors closed with a sound like a coffin lid settling into place, and Saren Voss stood alone before the Alpha King, barefoot and shaking, with no idea that she had just changed the course of the war that was coming. "What are you?" Theron asked. She opened her mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Brennick appeared at the king's shoulder. "Sire, the court physician should examine her. If she is carrying some form of suppression magic, we need to understand the scope before the Harkin summit." Theron held up a hand, and Brennick stopped speaking. The king's gaze remained locked on Saren. "What are you?" he asked again, quieter this time. "I do not know," Saren whispered. The king's jaw tightened. Something passed behind his eyes. Then he turned away sharply. "Escort her to the East Tower," he said to Brennick. "Post a guard. She does not leave until I say otherwise." Saren's stomach dropped. "Am I a prisoner?" she asked, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. Theron paused at the base of the dais, his back to her. He did not turn around. "You are my bride," he said, "and you are the most dangerous person in this castle. So yes, for the moment, you are exactly where I need you to be." He climbed the steps and disappeared through a door behind the throne. Brennick's hand settled on her elbow, firm but not unkind. "Come with me, please," he said. Saren followed him out, on legs that felt like water. That night, alone in the tower room, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her palms together to stop them shaking. The room was not a cell. There was a window, a fire in the hearth, and a tray of food on a small table by the door. She had not touched any of it. A knock on the door made her flinch. She straightened quickly, smoothing her expression into something she hoped looked composed. Yes. The door opened and Brennick stepped inside. He looked exactly the same as he had in the throne room. Composed, watchful, entirely unreadable. "Miss Voss," he said, "I have questions." "So do I," Saren replied before she could stop herself. Something flickered across the beta's face. Not quite a smile, but close. He settled into the chair by the fire. What happened to me? Saren asked. In the throne room? What did I do? You suppressed the wolf in every shifter in the room, simultaneously. Some of them are still shaking. The blood drained from Saren's face. I did not mean to. That makes it worse, not better, Brennick said calmly. If you had done it deliberately, it would suggest training, control, intent. The fact that it was involuntary suggests you have no idea what you are carrying, which means you cannot control it, which means it could happen again at any time. Saren's throat went tight. Is Lord Haskell going to demand my execution? Lord Haskell is currently drinking himself into a stupor and telling anyone who will listen that you are a witch from the old bloodlines, Brennick replied, which is not a compliment. The old bloodline witches were hunted to extinction centuries ago. I am not a witch, Saren said. Brennick leaned forward. When that pulse hit the room, did you feel anything specific? Pain? Heat? A sound? Saren shook her head. It felt like pressure. Like something building for a long time that suddenly released. I was afraid. And then it happened. Fear triggered it, Brennick noted. Physical contact from a threatening wolf. He stood and moved toward the door. The king wants you examined by the court healer tomorrow. And one more thing, Miss Voss. Saren looked up at him. In the throne room, when the suppression hit, it affected everyone. Every wolf in the room was brought down. He paused, his hand on the doorframe. But the king was the last to fall. He held out longer than anyone, almost as though the effect was weaker near him, or perhaps stronger. Mistress Orlin will want to explore that distinction. He left. Before Sarayan could ask what the difference meant, she sat in the quiet room and stared at the fire and tried not to think about the look in the king's eyes when he had asked her what she was. Not anger, not disgust. Something closer to recognition, as though she had confirmed a fear he had been carrying for a very long time. She did not sleep that night. In the morning, a guard arrived before the sun had fully risen. You are being summoned, he said, his expression carefully blank. Mistress Orlin is expecting you. Saren followed him into the corridor. Wolves passed them in the hallways, every one of them staring. Some pressed their backs against the wall to give her wide berth. Word had spread. The guard stopped at a heavy wooden door. Inside, he said. The room smelled of dried herbs and candle smoke. Shelves lined every wall, stuffed with jars and books, so old their spines had crumbled to dust. Behind the workbench, a woman, with iron-gray hair and eyes sharp enough to cut glass, looked up from a book. Sit, Mistress Orlin said. Saren sat. Give me your wrist, Orlin said. Orlin's fingers pressed into her pulse point. The healer closed her eyes, frowned, then opened them. Your blood work is unusual markers I have not encountered in a living person. Only in the old texts. She moved to the shelves and pulled down a leather-bound volume so thick it required both hands. Tell me about your parents, Orlin said. My mother died when I was 12. My father was killed in the border raids 2 years later. I never knew my father's family. Orlin's finger stopped on a page. She looked up with an expression that made Saren's pulse spike. What I am about to tell you is going to sound impossible. After yesterday I have adjusted my definition of impossible, Saren replied. 3 centuries ago, there existed a human bloodline called the Quellborn. Entirely human, but they carried a trait that allowed them to do something no other living creature could do. Saren felt the room tilt. Silence. Wolves, she whispered. The Quellborn gift was exactly that, Orlin continued, turning the book so Saren could see the page. The illustration was unmistakable. A human figure, standing in a ring of fallen wolves, hands open. They could project a field that severed the connection between a wolf and their animal self. Temporarily, at close range, but completely. The wolf would go silent. The shift would become impossible. Saren stared at the illustration. Why have I never heard of them? Orlin closed the book. Because the wolves hunted them to extinction. 300 years ago, a coalition of Alpha Kings declared the Quellborn an existential threat and ordered their eradication. Every known carrier was killed, every record was burned, the bloodline was supposed to be gone. Supposed to be, Saren repeated. And yet here you are, Orlin said. Someone survived. Someone hid. The bloodline thinned until the gift went dormant. Until you. Why now? Because you are surrounded by wolves for the first time. The gift responds to proximity. And the king? Saren asked carefully. Brennick said the effect was different near him. Orlan's gaze sharpened further. Different how? He said the king was the last to fall. That the effect was either weaker or stronger around him, and that you would want to explore the distinction. Orlan was quiet for a moment. Brennick is observant, she said finally, and he is correct. The distinction matters a great deal. If the suppression is weaker near the king, it suggests his wolf is resistant to your gift, which would make him the only alpha capable of withstanding you. But if it is stronger near him, if your power is drawn to him specifically and concentrating its force on his wolf because it recognizes him as the greatest threat in the room or for some other reason, she paused. That would change everything. Change everything how? Saren pressed. But before Orlan could answer, the door opened. Brennick stood in the doorway, his manner carrying the same careful blankness it always did, but something in his posture was different. Tighter. Mistress Orlan, he said. A message has arrived from the Greythorn border. Alpha King, Valdric Harkin, has moved his forces to the river crossing at Fenhollow. He is requesting a formal summit at Dunmarin within 6 weeks. Orlan's expression went flat. Requesting or demanding. The distinction is unclear, Brennick replied, which is the point. Even Serene recognized the name. Valdric Harkin, Alpha King of Greythorn, the wolf who had swallowed 4 neighboring territories in 2 years. The war everyone had been whispering about was coming here. Brennick's gaze shifted to Seren. The king has been informed of yesterday's events and of Mistress Orlan's preliminary assessment. He would like the Quellborn theory tested before the summit. Tested how? Saren asked, her voice tight. Under controlled conditions, Brennick said. Tomorrow morning, the training yard. You will be placed in proximity to shifted wolves, and we will see whether what happened in the throne room was a singular event or something that can be repeated. And if it can be repeated? Saren asked. Brennick and Orlan exchanged a look. The silence lasted a beat too long. Then you become very valuable, Miss Voss, Brennick said, and very dangerous. To both sides. He left the room. The door closed behind him. And Saren sat in the healer's study, surrounded by dusty books and dried herbs and the fading scent of candle smoke, and felt the first cold understanding settle over her. She was not just a treaty bride anymore. She was a weapon no one had known existed. And in 6 weeks, every wolf in the kingdom was going to be asking the same question. Could she do it again? The training yard was vast and open, bordered by the outer wall on one side and ancient oaks on the other. Brennick had arranged things quietly. No audience. Just 4 wolves from Theron's personal guard, standing in a loose semicircle, their postures coiled, their eyes tracking Saren with the flat focus of animals watching something they did not understand. Orlan stood to the side with a quill and parchment, her expression clinical. Brennick walked beside Saren, his hands clasped behind his back. The wolves will shift on my signal, he replied calmly. You will stand in the center. We want to see if your response is triggered by the shift itself, or by the proximity of wolves in their animal form. What if I cannot control it? Saren asked. That is precisely what we are testing, Brennick replied. And if I hurt someone? Brennick glanced at her. Yesterday you suppressed 300 wolves simultaneously. No one was physically harmed. The effect was temporary and non-violent. These 4 volunteered, knowing the risks. Saren doubted that volunteered was an entirely accurate description, but she kept that thought to herself. She walked to the center of the yard and stopped. The flagstones were cold under her thin shoes. The morning air was sharp, and her breath came in small white clouds that dissolved before they reached chest height. The 4 wolves watched her. She watched them back. Begin, Brennick called. The first wolf shifted. His body broke apart and reformed in the space of a breath, bones reshaping, muscles expanding, fur rippling across his skin. A wolf the size of a small horse stood where the guard had been. Saren's pulse spiked, but the quiet did not come. The second wolf shifted, then the third, then the fourth. 4 enormous wolves surrounded her, their combined presence a wall of muscle and teeth that her body registered as mortal danger. Still nothing. Saren clenched her fists, willing the power to activate, searching inside herself for the pressure she had felt in the throne room. She found nothing, empty silence where the quiet should have been. "I cannot do it," she called out, her voice cracking. "It is not happening." Orlin made a note on her parchment. Brennick's expression did not change. "Increase proximity," the beta ordered. The wolves moved closer. Saren's breath came faster. They were close now. Close enough that she could smell them. That hot animal musk that made every human instinct she possessed scream at her to run. One of the wolves lowered its head and growled. The sound vibrated through the ground and up through the soles of her feet and into her chest, where it rattled against her ribs like a fist pounding on a locked door. Nothing. "Physical contact," Brennick said. The nearest wolf lunged. Not an attack, but a deliberate surge forward that brought its muzzle within inches of her face. Hot breath washed over her skin, teeth, longer than her fingers, gleamed in the thin morning light. The door shattered. The quiet erupted with such force the ground seemed to shake. All 4 wolves slammed back into human form simultaneously, hitting the flagstones on their hands and knees, gasping and trembling. Saren stumbled backward, shaking. "There," Orlin said, her quill moving rapidly. "Fear. Response confirmed. The suppression is involuntary. Triggered by perceived threat from shifted wolves at close range." But Brennick was not looking at the wolves. He was looking past them, toward the covered walkway that bordered the training yard. Saren followed his gaze, and her stomach dropped. King Theron Mael stood in the shadow of the colonnade, leaning against a stone pillar with his arms crossed over his chest. He had been watching. She did not know for how long. Even at this distance, she could see the tension coiled through him, the rigid set of his shoulders. The way his hands gripped his own forearms hard enough that the tendons stood out against his skin. Their eyes met across the yard. And Saren felt something she had not expected. Not the quiet, something else entirely. A pull, faint but unmistakable. A thread of connection stretching between them like a wire drawn tight, and the longer she held his gaze, the stronger it hummed. Theron pushed off the pillar abruptly and turned away. He disappeared into the interior corridor without a word. But Saren had seen his expression in that final moment before he turned. She had seen the look in his eyes, and it was the same look he had worn in the throne room. Not anger, not disgust, not even interest. Fear. The Alpha King of Dunmerran was afraid of her, and that realization landed in her gut like a stone and refused to move. Orlin appeared at her side, tucking the parchment into her satchel. The suppression radius appears to extend roughly 40 paces in every direction. Involuntary activation requires perceived threat, combined with shifted wolf proximity. Duration of effect, approximately 10 seconds before natural recovery. "And the king?" Saren asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "He was watching. Did it reach him?" Orlin glanced toward the corridor where Theron had vanished. He was outside the immediate radius. "But given what happened in the throne room, I suspect the effect would reach him regardless of distance. Your power seems to be drawn to dominant wolves. The stronger the alpha, the harder the quiet pushes." "That is not comforting," Saren muttered. "It is not meant to be," Orlin replied. "Miss Voss, you need to understand something. Alpha King Valdric Harkin is coming to this court in 6 weeks. He is the most aggressive territorial alpha in living memory. He has conquered 4 kingdoms through a combination of brute strength and strategic cunning, and he has never lost a challenge." "I am aware," Saren said tightly. "Then you should also be aware that you are the only weapon in this kingdom, capable of neutralizing an alpha of his caliber. Your power does not just suppress wolves. It strips them of the very thing that makes them dangerous." The weight of that statement pressed down on Saren's shoulders like a physical force. "I am," A person, she murmured. Not a weapon. Orlin's expression softened for the first time. The change was slight, a loosening around her eyes, a gentling of her voice, that spoke of decades of delivering hard truths to frightened people. I know, child, she said. But in 6 weeks, that distinction may not matter to anyone except you and me. That afternoon, Brennick came to see her in the tower room. He brought a change of clothes, better fitting than the dress she had arrived in, and a pair of soft leather boots lined with wool. Theron has made a decision regarding your situation, Brennick said, standing by the door with his hands behind his back. Saren's heart stuttered. Am I being sent away? The opposite, Brennick replied. You are to remain at the castle under Mistress Orlin's supervision. She will work with you daily to understand and develop your abilities. Your quarters will be moved from the tower to the royal wing. Saren blinked at him. The royal wing? Where Theron's chambers are? Yes. Why? Brennick hesitated. It was the first time she had seen him pause, and it made her deeply uneasy. The king believes your proximity may be relevant to the effectiveness of your abilities. Orlin's initial findings suggest the suppression field is influenced by your emotional state and by your physical distance from dominant wolves. The king is the most dominant wolf in Dunmerran. If your power calibrates itself to him, it would be best to understand that dynamic thoroughly before the summit. Saren translated this in her head. So I am being moved closer to him so you can study how my power reacts to him. Specifically, essentially. Yes. Does the king want me there? Another pause, longer this time. The king recognizes the tactical necessity, Brennick said carefully, which was not the same thing as wanting her there, and they both knew it. Saren followed Brennick through the castle corridors to the royal wing. Her new room was adjacent to Theron's chambers. When she pressed her ear to the shared wall, she could hear him. Footsteps. The creak of a chair. The scratch of a pen on parchment. Separated by 2 feet of stone, and the awareness of his presence settled into her bones like warmth from a fire she could not see. It was going to be a very long 6 weeks. The first evening passed in unbearable silence. Through the wall, she could hear the king, the scrape of a chair, the heavy fall of boots dropped on stone, a long, slow exhale that sounded like it carried the weight of the entire kingdom behind it. She pressed her ear to the wall and immediately felt ridiculous. A grown woman in a borrowed nightdress, straining to hear whether the Alpha King was brushing his teeth. Sleep came eventually, thin and restless. She woke before dawn. The first real encounter happened by accident. She opened her door and turned toward the staircase and nearly walked directly into the king's chest. He caught her by the shoulders on reflex. For a fraction of a second, they stood there. Close enough that his scent hit her like a wave. Pine and iron and something warm and distinctly alive. The quiet stirred behind her ribs, not erupting, not releasing, but shifting, like a sleeping creature turning over. Theron's hands dropped from her shoulders, like she had burned him. He stepped back, his jaw tight, his expression locked down. My apologies, Saren said quickly. He looked at her, and she watched something complicated move behind his eyes. Then he shook his head once. You should be more careful. I was being careful, Saren replied, her pride stinging. You were standing directly outside my door. Something moved behind his expression. Not amusement, nothing that generous, but a crack in the stone, a flicker of surprise that she had pushed back at all. Fair point, he said. Rough, with sleep, lower than it had been in the throne room, and the sound of it did something unpleasant to her composure. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor without another word. Saren leaned against her doorframe and pressed a hand to her chest, where her heart was doing something entirely unreasonable. He had touched her, his hands on her shoulders, steadying her, and the quiet had not erupted, it had stirred. Shifted, responded to him, differently than it responded to any other wolf. Not with violence, but with a sensation uncomfortably close to recognition. She thought of Orlin's words. The distinction between the suppression being weaker near him or stronger. The healer had said it would change everything. Standing in the cold corridor in the thin morning light, Saren was beginning to understand why. A pattern formed. Mornings with Orlin, learning about the Quellborn bloodline. Afternoons in the training yard with Brennick. Evenings alone, listening to Theron, exist on the other side of the wall. They did not speak again after the corridor incident, but she felt him like a constant low hum at the edges of her awareness, a vibration in her blood that intensified when he was near and faded to a dull ache when he was far. Something that grew stronger every day, like roots pushing through stone. On the fourth morning, she found a cloak folded on the chair outside her door. Dark blue wool, lined with fur, the kind of garment that cost more than she had earned in a year at the Ashenmere herbalist shop. There was no note, no explanation. The castle corridors were cold in the mornings, and her thin borrowed dresses offered little protection. Someone had noticed. She did not ask who. That evening, as she passed the king's door on her way to her room, she paused. He was inside. Not the usual sounds of work, the scratch of pen on paper, the turning of pages. Instead, silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that she could feel through the oak, like heat through glass. Saren raised her hand to knock, then stopped herself. She stood there for a long moment, her fist hovering an inch from the wood, feeling the pull between them grow sharper. Then she lowered her hand and walked to her own door and closed it behind her, and told herself it was not her business. She was a treaty bride, a weapon being studied. Not someone who knocked on the king's door because the silence worried her. But she lay awake for a long time that night, listening. And when she finally heard him move, heard the creak of his chair and the quiet sound of pages turning, the ache loosened just enough to let her sleep. The training changed after the first week. In the beginning, it had been clinical. Orlin, with her parchment, Brennick, calling orders. The guards, shifting in sequences while Saren tried to make the quiet obey her. It did not obey. Then Theron started coming to the sessions. He did not announce it. He simply appeared on the 9th morning, walking through the gate of the training yard in a loose shirt with his sleeves rolled to his forearms, and told Brennick he would be taking over. Taking over what, exactly? Saren asked, not sure whether to be alarmed or offended. Your training, Theron replied, without looking at her. He was stretching his shoulders in a way that suggested he was preparing for something physical, and the sight of his forearms flexing made her lose her train of thought entirely. The suppression needs to be controlled, he continued. Orlin's research confirms that it responds most strongly to dominant wolves. I am the most dominant wolf available. If you can learn to modulate the quiet against me, you can modulate it against anyone. The logic was sound. The execution was devastating. Because training with Theron meant proximity to Theron, real proximity. Not the muffled awareness of him through a stone wall or the brief collision in a corridor, his hand on her wrist, adjusting her stance. His voice in her ear, low and steady, telling her to focus. The heat of him standing behind her, while she tried to summon the quiet on command. His chest, close enough to her back, that warmth radiated off his skin without touching it. Focus, he said. I am focusing, Saren managed. Though what she was focusing on had very little to do with the quiet, and very much to do with the way his thumb had settled against the inside of her wrist where her pulse was hammering. Your heart rate is elevated, he observed. Yes, well, I am trying to suppress a supernatural force inside my body. It is stressful. He was quiet for a beat. Is that the only reason? Saren did not answer that question. She was not going to answer that question. She would rather face Lord Haskell and his teeth again than answer that question. But something changed between them. After that, a crack in the wall, barely visible, but enough to let light through. He began talking to her during sessions. Not just commands and corrections, but actual conversation. He told her about the border territories, about the villages along the Greythorn line that lived in constant fear of Valdrick's expansion. He described the people there with a specificity that surprised her. A blacksmith named Torvin, who had lost his forge to raiders. A healer in a town called Millhaven, who sent monthly reports on civilian injuries, with meticulous, heartbreaking detail. You read them all? Saren asked, after he mentioned the reports. Everyone, Theron said. There was no pride in it. No performance, just the flat statement of a man who considered it his duty to know exactly how much his people were suffering. Saren felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with the quiet. That must be exhausting, she said carefully. He glanced at her, and for a moment, the mask slipped. Not fully, not enough for anyone watching from a distance to notice, but enough for her. She saw the weariness beneath the control, the weight he carried that pressed down on him like stone. It is the job, he said. It is more than a job, Saren replied. It is every life in the kingdom, sitting on your shoulders. No one can carry that without cost. He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then he turned away. Again, try the suppression at half strength, this time. But that night, she found a second cloak, folded outside her door, heavier than the first, lined with dark fur that was impossibly soft against her fingers. And beneath it, a pair of leather gloves, sized for hands smaller than any wolf in the castle would possess. She pressed the gloves against her face, and breathed in the scent of new leather, and tried not to smile like a fool. The next morning at training, she wore the gloves. Theron noticed. He did not comment, but she caught the way his gaze lingered on her hands, and the faintest softening at the corners of his mouth before he turned away. Today, we try something different, he said. Controlled contact. Saren's pulse spiked. Meaning what? Meaning, I shift, and you place your hand on my wolf. We need to know whether physical contact changes the nature of the suppression. Saren stared at him. You want me to touch you while you are in wolf form? Is that a problem? A dozen problems flooded her mind. She had never touched a shifted wolf voluntarily. Every encounter so far had been reactive, defensive, her power erupting in panic. Touching Theron's wolf, deliberately, calmly, with intention, felt like stepping off a cliff. No problem at all, she lied. Theron shifted. The transformation was faster than any she had witnessed, his body folding and reforming with a fluid grace that the guard's shifts had never possessed, and the wolf that stood before her was enormous. Black-furred and silver-eyed, his head level with her chest, his body radiating a heat she could feel from 3 paces away. Saren approached slowly. The wolf watched her with eyes that were unmistakably Theron's. Intelligent, guarded, and beneath the control. Something raw and patient. She reached out and placed her palm on the side of his neck. The quiet did not erupt. It did not surge or crash or shatter. It unfolded. Slowly, gently, like a hand opening. She felt it flow from her palm into his wolf, and instead of silencing the animal, it draped over it like a blanket. The wolf's massive body shuddered once, then relaxed, his eyes half closed. A low rumble built in his chest, not a growl but something closer to a purr, vibrating against her palm. Oh, Saren breathed. Orlin was scribbling furiously on her parchment. Sustained physical contact produces a calming effect rather than full suppression. Remarkable. The quiet modulates its intensity based on emotional context and the specific bond between the Quellborn and the target wolf. Saren barely heard her. She was too focused on the wolf leaning into her touch, on the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers, on the steady thrum of connection pulsing between them. It felt like coming home to a place she had never been. When Theron shifted back, he was kneeling in front of her, breathing hard, her hand now resting on his bare shoulder. They were very close, close enough that she could count the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. That was, he started. Different, Saren finished. Yes, he said, and his voice was not quite steady. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Orlin cleared her throat pointedly from across the yard, and they both pulled back, as though waking from a trance. The training continued. Day after day she learned, not just the mechanics of the quiet, but the shape of it inside her. It was not a weapon in the way a sword was a weapon. It was alive. It had preferences. It responded to emotion. to intent, to the specific wolf in front of her. Against the guards, it erupted with blunt, indiscriminate force. Against Theron, it behaved differently, softer, more precise. It did not slam his wolf into silence but pressed against it gently, like a hand on a restless animal's back. It recognizes you, Orlin told her one evening, reviewing the day's notes. The quiet treats him differently than every other wolf. Why? Saren asked. Orlin gave her a look that was far too knowing. You already know why. She just was not ready to say it out loud. On the 14th night, she was reading by candlelight when she heard something through the wall. Not the usual sounds of Theron's evening routine, but something else. Ragged breathing. A low, strangled sound that might have been a word or might have been a groan. She was on her feet before she consciously decided to move. She crossed to the shared wall and pressed her palm against the cold stone. The sound came again. Worse this time. The sound of someone fighting something in their sleep, losing the battle. Saren left her room and crossed the 2 steps to his door. She stood there with her hand raised, her pulse roaring, every rational thought telling her to go back to bed. She knocked. The sound stopped. Silence. Then footsteps, and the door opened. Theron stood in the doorway. His hair disheveled, his breathing too fast. His eyes were wild. For a fraction of a second before he locked them down. What? He asked, his voice rough. I heard you through the wall, Saren said. You were having a nightmare. Something crossed him. Vulnerability, maybe, or shame. It was gone too quickly to name. I am fine, he said. You are not fine. You are making sounds that would terrify a battlefield surgeon. His jaw tightened. Go back to bed, Miss Voss. Saren, she corrected quietly. You have been training with me for 2 weeks. I think we have moved past surnames. He stared at her. She stared back. The corridor was dark and cold, and she was standing in front of the Alpha King in her nightdress, with her feet bare on the stone floor, and the bond hummed between them like a wire pulled taut. Good night, Saren, he said softly. Her name in his mouth did something catastrophic to her composure. Good night, Theron, she whispered. He closed the door. She stood in the corridor for a long time before going back to her room. When she finally slept, she dreamed of gray eyes and the weight of a kingdom, and she woke with her hand pressed against the wall between them. 3 days later, Valdric Harkon's envoy arrived at Dunmerran. The envoy's name was Calix. He was tall and lean, with a face like a blade, and eyes that catalogued everything they touched. He arrived with a retinue of 12 wolves, all of them carrying the Greythorn insignia on their armor, and the atmosphere in the castle changed the moment they passed through the gates. Saren watched from a high window as the group crossed the courtyard. Even from this distance, she could sense them. The quiet stirred at the edges of her awareness, pressing outward, agitated in a way it had not been since the throne room. Valdric's advance guard, Orlin said, appearing beside her at the window. Scouts wearing diplomatic clothes. They are testing us, Saren said. They are testing everything. The defenses, the court, the king's temperament. Orlin's gaze sharpened. And if they discover what you are, they will be testing you as well. The official reception was held in the Great Hall that evening. Saren was told to attend, but to stay in the background, unremarkable, invisible. Brennick positioned her at a table near the far wall, surrounded by minor nobles and visiting merchants. Out of sight, out of mind, it almost worked. Calix delivered his master's greetings, with the polished ease of a man wearing courtesy, like a mask over something uglier. He spoke of the summit, of Valdric's desire for peaceful resolution, of the long friendship between Greythorn and Dunmerran. Every word was perfectly chosen, perfectly delivered, and perfectly false. Theron listened without expression. Saren watched him from across the hall and marveled at his control. His anger reached her through the bond, faint but unmistakable, a slow burn beneath the surface that he did not allow to reach his face. Then Calix's gaze found her. It happened casually, a sweep of the room, the practiced evaluation of a spy cataloging threats. His eyes passed over her, moved on, then snapped back. He stared at her for a beat too long, his nostrils flaring slightly, scenting the air. Saren's blood went cold. The human bride, Calix said, turning back to Theron with a thin smile. I had heard the treaty included such a provision. How charming. I trust she is adjusting well to life among wolves. She is adjusting fine, Theron said, his tone leaving no room for further inquiry. But Calix did not let it go. He looked at Saren again, and this time his smile widened. My Lord Valdric has a keen interest in the old bloodlines. He considers them a fascinating area of study. The Quellborn, for instance. Such a tragedy. Their extinction. The word Quellborn detonated in the silence, like a stone dropped from a great height. Across the hall, Theron's hand clenched around his goblet so hard the metal warped. Orlin had told her the Quellborn were supposed to be forgotten, erased from history. The fact that Valdric Harkin knew the name, cared enough to have his envoy speak it aloud in a rival court, meant something terrible. He knew, or he suspected, and he was letting them know that he knew. Calix held the silence for exactly long enough, then inclined his head. A topic for the summit, perhaps. Good evening, Your Majesty. He withdrew with his retinue. The doors closed behind them, and Theron rose from his seat with a violent, controlled motion that sent his chair scraping backward across the stone floor. Brennick, he said, my office, now. His gaze swept to Saren across the hall, and what she saw made her stomach drop. Not anger directed at her, something worse. Fear. Fear for her. Later, Brennick found her in the corridor outside her room. Theron believes Valdric has been searching for Quellborn descendants, the beta said, without preamble. Saren leaned against the wall. Why? What would he want? With the Quellborn? Control, Brennick said flatly. The ability to silence any rival alpha at will. If Valdric could harness or weaponize the quiet, no wolf alive could challenge his expansion. He would be unstoppable. The implications cascaded through Saren's mind. He does not just want territory. He wants me. Brennick's silence was confirmation enough. What happens when he arrives for the summit? Saren pressed. If he knows what I am, he will demand me as part of any negotiation. Or he will take me by force. Theron will not allow that, Brennick said, and there was steel in his voice she had not heard before. The king may not have a choice, Saren replied. Brennick looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, he will burn this kingdom to the ground. Before he lets anyone take you, you understand that. Yes? The words landed like a blow, not because they frightened her, but because she believed them. The truth of it reached her, even now, even with Theron somewhere else in the castle. The fierce, barely contained protectiveness radiating from him like heat from a forge. That is exactly what I am afraid of, Saren whispered. That night, unable to sleep, Saren walked the corridors of the castle. She told herself she needed air. In truth, she needed distance from the wall between her room and Theron's, from the sound of his restless pacing, from the ache that intensified with every hour. She turned a corner near the guest wing and froze. Voices behind a half-open door, Calix's smooth cadence. The girl is Quellborn. Lord Valdric was right to send us. A second voice. And the king, bonded to her, or close to it, which complicates things beautifully. If we take her before the summit, the king comes for her with his entire army. Valdric destroys them in the open field. If we wait, Valdric demands her during the summit. Either way, she belongs to Greythorn before the year turns. Saren pressed herself against the wall, her heart slamming against her ribs. The cold stone bit into her shoulder blades through the thin fabric of her nightdress. And if the king refuses? The second voice asked. Then, Valdric kills him in the challenge ring and takes her as spoils. There is no outcome where we lose. Saren backed away from the door on silent feet, her mind racing. She needed to tell Theron. She needed to tell Brennick. She needed to tell someone that Valdric was not coming for a summit at all. He was coming for a slaughter. She ran. She found Theron in his office, Brennick already at his side. The words spilled out of her in a rush, everything she had heard, every calculated word of Calix's plan. When she finished, the silence was absolute. Theron's knuckles were white against the edge of his desk, A vein pulsed at his temple. His rage reached her through the bond, enormous and barely leashed, like a storm pressing against the walls of a room too small to contain it. "He wants to use you," Theron said, and each word sounded like it cost him something. "He has been hunting Quellborn survivors. This entire summit is a trap. Then we use it against him," Siren said. "If we know what he is planning, we can prepare." "You are not preparing for anything," Theron said, and the sudden shift in his tone made her step back. The rage was gone. In its place was something cold and immovable. "Theron," Siren started, "Collix has seen you. He has reported back to Valdric. By now, Greythorn knows exactly what you are, and exactly how to use you against me." He stood, and the chair scraped back across the stone. "The only way to protect you is to make you unreachable." Siren felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "What are you saying?" He would not meet her eyes. The next morning, Theron was waiting for her in the training yard. His face was set in hard lines, his body coiled with a tension she could feel from 20 paces away. "The arrangement is changing," he said. Siren's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "Collix and his retinue are still inside the castle. Every day they remain is a day they can observe you, test you, report back to Valdric. You need to be removed from their line of sight." "Removed how?" "You are leaving Dunmerrin," Theron said. "Tomorrow. Brennick will escort you to a safe house in the northern hills until the summit is concluded." The words hit her like a physical blow. Siren stared at him, waiting for the rest. For the part where he explained the plan, the strategy, the reason this was temporary, he did not. "You are sending me away," she said. "I am keeping you safe. From Valdric? Or from you?" His jaw tightened. Siren moved toward him. "Theron, you need me here. If Valdric comes to this summit and you do not have the quiet on your side, he will challenge you and he will win. You know that. I will handle Valdric." "How?" "By dying. Because that is what will happen if he gets you alone, without my ability to neutralize his wolf." "You do not know that," Theron said, but his voice cracked at the edges, and the lie of it reached her through the bond. "I know that you have not slept properly since Collix arrived," Siren said, stepping closer. "I know you are afraid, not for yourself, but for me, and you are letting that fear make a decision that will get you killed." "That is my decision to make." His voice was rising. "It is not," Siren shot back. "Not anymore. We share a bond, Theron. You feel it the same as I do. What happens to you happens to me." The word bond landed between them like a blade. His face went pale, not with surprise. She could see that he already knew, had probably known since the first time the quiet responded to him differently. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing her claim it, stripped away the last wall he had built between them. "That is exactly why you need to leave," and his voice was quiet. Now. Quiet and raw and devastated. "Because if he takes you, if he hurts you, I will not be able to think clearly. I will not be able to lead. I will burn everything to protect you, and my kingdom will pay the price." Siren felt tears burning at the back of her eyes. "And if the bond breaks because of distance? Aurelin told me an incomplete bond can damage both parties. If they are separated too long, I will survive it," Theron said. "You will not. Then at least you will." He walked away from her, and the finality in the movement was crushing. "The escort leaves at dawn. Please be ready." He walked out of the training yard. He did not look back. Siren stood alone in the cold morning air, her arms wrapped around herself, and felt the bond between them stretching like a wire being pulled past its limit. Something tightened inside her, with a pain that had nothing to do with the quiet, and everything to do with the man who was walking away from her to keep her safe. Even if it destroyed them both. She did not go to the safe house. She refused. Brennick arrived at her door before dawn, and she told him plainly that she was not leaving. "The king gave a direct order," Brennick said, carefully. "The king is making a mistake. That may be true, but he is still the king. And I am the only person in this kingdom who can stop Valdric Harkin," Siren said, holding the beta's gaze. "You know it, Orlin knows it. Theron knows it, which is why he is so afraid. Send me away, and you remove the one advantage Dunmarin has. Brennick regarded her for a long time. Then he exhaled through his nose, a sound that might have been frustration, or might have been reluctant admiration. I will buy you one day, he said. One day before the escort forces the issue. Use it wisely. He left. Saren closed the door and pressed her back against it and tried to plan her next move. The healer listened to everything, the overheard conversation, Valdrick's plan, Theron's decision to send her away. When Saren finished, Orlin sat quietly for a long time. He is trying to protect you the only way he knows how, Orlin said finally. He is trying to protect me in a way that will kill us both, Saren replied. Orlin sighed. The bond between you is still forming. The Quelborn gift has woven itself into the connection. Your power and his wolf are entangled at a level I have never seen documented. Separation will not cause the bond to fade. It will cause it to fracture. And a fractured bond does not heal. It hemorrhages. Have you told him this? Saren demanded. I have tried. His fear for you has become louder than his reason. Saren spent the rest of the morning in the training yard alone, running through the suppression exercises Theron had taught her, trying to find stability in the familiar movements, but the quiet felt wrong without him. Muted, dull, like a bell struck in an empty room, producing sound but no resonance. She returned to her chamber at midday, and found that someone had packed a travel bag and left it on her bed. Inside were provisions, a change of clothes, and a sealed letter bearing the royal crest. She did not open the letter. She could not bear to read his careful, measured words, explaining why abandoning her was the rational choice. But the bond had other ideas. By midday, the headache started. A dull, persistent ache behind her eyes that sharpened every hour. By afternoon, her hands were trembling. By evening, the pain had spread to her entire body. A hollow, gnawing sensation, like hunger but deeper, rooted in her bones rather than her stomach. She knew what it was. Orlin had warned her. The bond, incomplete and unacknowledged, was punishing the distance between them. Not physical distance, because Theron was still in the castle. Emotional distance. The rejection. The wall he had thrown up between them to protect her was poisoning them both. Through the wall of her room she could hear him, pacing, restless. The occasional sound of something hitting the desk hard enough to rattle the objects on its surface. He was suffering too. It reached her, muffled and distant, as though she were hearing his pain through water. Saren curled on her bed and pressed her hands against her temples, and rode out the waves of agony that crashed through her with increasing force. She thought about going to him, about crossing those 2 steps of corridor and pounding on his door and refusing to leave until he stopped pretending. That distance was the answer, but her body would not cooperate. The pain had become a cage, locking her in place, draining her strength, until even lifting her head from the pillow felt like an act of extraordinary will. The quiet destabilized. Small pulses escaped her involuntarily, rattling the window glass. Everything Theron had taught her about focus was slipping away. She tried to eat. The bread tasted like dust. Every sound from beyond the wall was a knife turning slowly. On the second day of distance, a servant brought a message from Brennick, a single line, written in the Beda's careful hand. Theron has not eaten since you last spoke. He will not allow anyone near him. Saren crumpled the note in her fist and pressed it against her forehead. He was doing this to protect her, starving himself, isolating himself, tearing himself apart from the inside. And every moment of it reached her through the fraying thread of their bond. She dragged herself to the window and looked down into the courtyard. In the far corner, half hidden by the shadow of the outer wall, she saw him. Theron stood alone in the cold, his hands braced against the stone, his head bowed. Even from 3 stories above, she could see the way his shoulders shook. He was breaking. They were both breaking. She heard Orlin's voice in the corridor outside, sharp and alarmed. The door opened. "God's above, child," Orlin breathed, rushing to her side. How long have you been like this? Since morning, Saren managed through gritted teeth. Orlin pressed a hand to her forehead, then pulled it back as though she had been burned. Your temperature is spiking. The bond is destabilizing. She turned to the doorway. Get the king. Now. He will not come, Saren whispered. He will come, Orlin said, her voice fierce and certain. Because if he does not, you will both be dead by morning. Saren closed her eyes. The pain was everywhere now, in her blood, in her bones, in the hollow space behind her ribs, where something vital had lived and was now unraveling like thread pulled from a spool. She heard Orlin move to the door. Heard her voice, sharp and commanding, directed at someone in the corridor. Heard the word king, and dying, and, now, footsteps, running. More than one set, then silence. A terrible, suspended silence that stretched like the moment before a fall. The door opened, and even through the agony, even through the haze of pain and fever, and the fraying edges of her consciousness, Saren felt him. Felt the bond flare with desperate, terrified recognition. Felt his presence crash over her like a wave breaking against a shore. She opened her eyes. Theron stood in the doorway, and he looked worse than she did. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed, his skin carrying a gray pallor that made him look like a man standing at the edge of his own grave. He stared at her, and the mask he wore for the world, for his court, for his enemies, shattered completely. What have I done? He whispered. Saren reached for him. Her hand trembled so badly she could barely lift it from the blanket. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took her hand in both of his, pressing it against his cheek, and she felt the wetness on his cheeks before she understood what it meant. The Alpha King of Dunmoran was crying. And Saren, with the last thread of strength she possessed, pulled his hand to her heart and held it there, and whispered, "Stay." He stayed. Theron did not leave her side that night. He sat on the edge of her bed, with her hand pressed between both of his, and Saren felt the bond respond immediately. The hemorrhaging slowed, the agony receded, not completely, but enough that she could breathe without wanting to scream. Orlin worked through the night, preparing tinctures and monitoring them both, with the grim efficiency of a woman who had been expecting this exact catastrophe. The bond needs to be completed, Orlin told Theron plainly, sometime after midnight. Not tomorrow, not when you are ready now. The fracture has gone too deep. If you wait much longer, no amount of proximity will repair it. Theron's hand tightened around Saren's. She is barely conscious. She is more conscious than you think, Saren murmured, opening her eyes. He looked down at her, and the raw relief on him made something ache in an entirely different way. I should never have sent you away. His voice was barely above a whisper. No, you should not have. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself, Saren corrected gently, from how much it would hurt if you lost me. The truth of it landed between them like a stone in still water. He did not deny it. Instead, he lifted her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, a gesture so tender it nearly broke her. I have spent my entire reign building walls, he said against her skin. Walls around the kingdom, walls around the court, walls around myself. I believed that if I kept everything at a distance, nothing could hurt the people I was responsible for. He paused, and his next breath came out shaking. And then you walked into my throne room and brought 300 wolves to their knees, and every wall I had ever built became useless. Saren reached up and touched his face. His cheek was rough with stubble, warm beneath her fingers. He leaned into her hand on instinct, his eyes closing. The first night you slept in the room next to mine, he continued. I stood on the other side of the wall and pressed my hand against the stone. I could feel you there. Like warmth coming through glass. I told myself it meant nothing. It meant everything, Saren whispered. I know that now. He opened his eyes. I have been so afraid of what you are, of what you could do, of how completely you could undo me. But losing you, feeling the bond break, that was worse than any fear I have ever known. And I have known war, Saren. I have known death, and defeat, and failure. None of it compared to the moment Orlin told me you were dying. Saren pulled him closer. He came willingly, lowering himself beside her on the narrow bed, his arms wrapping around her with a desperate gentleness that made her throat tight. "I do not want to be protected from you," she said against his chest. "I want to stand beside you, even against Valdric, especially against Valdric." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled back far enough to look at her face. "You are braver than any wolf I have ever commanded." "That is because I am not a wolf," Saren said. "I am something else entirely." The corner of his mouth lifted, the first genuine smile she had ever seen him wear, and it transformed him. He was beautiful, not in the cold, carved way she had thought at first, but in the way of something thawing, of ice breaking, on a river, in early spring. Saren kissed him. She rose up and pressed her mouth to his, and he made a sound in the back of his throat, low and broken and grateful, and his hands came up to cradle her face like she was something precious and impossible. The kiss deepened. His mouth opened against hers, and the taste of him flooded her senses, pine and iron and the warm living scent underneath, that she had been breathing through the wall for weeks. She wanted more. She wanted closer. She wanted every barrier between them gone. He pulled back, breathing hard. "Saren, I know," she whispered. "I want to. If we do this, the bond seals. Permanently. You will be tied to me, to this kingdom, to every war and burden that comes with it. There is no undoing it." "I know," she said again. "You deserve a choice." Saren looked at him, at the man who had left her cloaks and gloves outside her door without a note, who had pressed his hand against a wall to feel her presence on the other side, who had wept when he thought he might lose her. "I made my choice the night I knocked on your door," she said. "I made it again when I refused to leave. I am making it now. Stop asking me to reconsider, and let me love you." His composure broke. He pressed his forehead against hers. "Before you, I had not let anyone close since the Unification Wars. I lost people, Saren, good people who followed me into battle because they trusted me, and I could not keep them all alive. After that, I decided the safest thing was to need no one. If I needed no one, then losing someone would never destroy me again. And then I arrived," Saren said softly. "Then you arrived. And you were so frustratingly brave, and so impossibly kind, and you knocked on my door in the middle of the night because you heard me having a nightmare, and every wall I had spent years building became nothing." She traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "You do not have to carry everything alone anymore. I am beginning to understand that," he said. He kissed her with an intensity that erased every careful, measured thing he had ever been. His hands moved to her waist, her back, pulling her against him until there was nothing between them but the thin fabric of their clothes, and the burning, undeniable pull, demanding completion. What followed was beyond words. Not a collision, but a surrender, both of them letting go of every wall, every fear, every reason they had built to keep the world at arm's length. She held him, and he held her, and the distance that had nearly killed them both dissolved into nothing. The bond sealed like a door swinging open inside her, light and warmth, and the sudden staggering awareness of him. Not just his presence beside her, but his mind, his heart, the deep architecture of who he was flooding through her in a golden wave. She felt his wolf on the other side of the bond, not suppressed, not silenced, but at peace, calm, complete in a way it had never been before. The quiet hummed between them, no longer a weapon, but a bridge, connecting them at a level that went deeper than anything she had ever known. They lay together afterward, warmth thrumming between them, like a second heartbeat. Saren pressed her forehead against his chest and felt his hands slide into her hair, gentle and possessive. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Whole," Theron said. "For the first time in my life," she smiled against his skin. "The summit is in 6 days. I know. We need to prepare." "I know that too." His arms tightened around her. Saren closed her eyes and let herself have it. The warmth, the safety, the impossible reality of being held by the man she loved, who loved her back, who had chosen her despite every wall he had built, and every fear that had tried to keep them apart. Tomorrow, they would plan. Tomorrow, they would prepare for war. Tonight they slept, together and peacefully, and without fear. The 6 days that followed were the most intense of Seren's life. Everything changed after the bond sealed. The quiet, which had been unpredictable and reactive for weeks, became responsive. Seren could summon it at will. She could shape it, direct it, control its intensity with a precision that left even Orlin speechless. The bond stabilized the gift. The healer observed during a training session where Seren had suppressed and released 4 wolves in rapid succession without breaking a sweat. Before, the quiet was operating on instinct alone. Now it has an anchor. The king's wolf gives it a fixed point to calibrate against. But the real discovery came on the 3rd day. Seren and Theron were training together as they did every morning now, moving through exercises that blended her suppression drills with his combat forms. Theron lunged toward her at full speed. She raised her hand. The quiet surged outward, and instead of suppressing his wolf, it wrapped around him like armor. Theron staggered to a halt, staring down at his own body. "What did you do?" Seren stared at her hands. "I do not know. I was trying to push back, and instead it just went around you." Orlin was already scribbling. Selective shielding. She can choose who the quiet affects. If she can shield Theron while suppressing every other wolf in range, then in the challenge ring, the implication hit all 3 of them simultaneously. "Valdric loses his wolf while I keep mine," Theron said slowly. "That is not a fair fight," Seren replied. "Valdric has never fought a fair fight in his life," Brennick said, from the edge of the yard, where he had been watching in silence. "He has poisoned 2 rival alphas and bought 3 others betas before challenges. Whatever he brings to this summit, it will not be fairness." They trained until Seren's muscles burned and her head swam. She practiced the selective suppression until she could hold it for minutes at a time, shielding Theron while forcing every other wolf in the yard to their human forms. The court learned of their mating on the 2nd day. The reaction was precisely what Seren had expected: shock from the nobles, outrage from the traditionalists who believed an alpha king's mate should be a wolf of noble blood, and from a smaller, quieter faction, something that surprised her: acceptance. An old commander named Eric, who had served under Theron in the Unification Wars, stopped her in the corridor and bowed his head. "Your Majesty," he said, using the title for the first time. "I watched you bring Haskell to his knees. On your first day in this castle, I have been waiting to see what you would do next." Seren was so startled, she forgot to respond. By the time she found her voice, Eric had already walked away. On the 4th evening, Seren sat with Orlin and Brennick in the healer's study, reviewing strategy. "Valdric will not come alone," Brennick said, studying the map spread across the workbench. "He will bring his best fighters. If the challenge goes sideways, he will have wolves positioned to seize the hall by force. Then I need to suppress them all simultaneously," Seren said. "Every Greythorn wolf in the room, while keeping every Dunmerin wolf standing." "Can you do that?" Brennick asked. "I have been doing it with 4 wolves in the training yard. The summit will have 300. The silence that followed was honest and uncomfortable. "The principle is the same," Orlin said carefully, "but the scale is unprecedented." "Then we make it precedented," Seren replied. She looked at Brennick. "I need more wolves in training. As many as you can spare. I have 2 days to scale the selective suppression from 4 targets to 300. Brennick studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. "You will have 50 by morning. I will rotate them in shifts." The next 2 days were punishing. Seren trained from dawn until her legs buckled, suppressing larger and larger groups, while shielding a growing number of Dunmerin wolves. By the end of the 5th day, she could hold the selective field against 80 wolves simultaneously. It was not 300, but the quiet was growing stronger, with every session, feeding on the sealed connection, on the anchor that Theron's wolf provided. On the 5th day, scouts reported Valdric's army approaching from the south. 300 wolves, marching in formation, with the Alpha King of Greythorn at their head. On the evening of the 5th day, They stood on the ramparts together and watched the greythorn column approach across the southern plain. Torches moved through the dusk like a river of fire, hundreds of them, stretching back along the road as far as Saren could see. Theron's hand found hers. That is a larger force than he declared. He brought an army, not a diplomatic party, Serene replied. Are you frightened? Serene considered the question honestly. The torches below were beautiful and terrible, and behind each one was a wolf, who wanted to take her kingdom, her king, her life. She should have been terrified. No, surprised to find that it was true. Saren looked at her. I spent my entire life being afraid. Afraid of wolves, afraid of being invisible, afraid that I was nothing. She turned to face him, the wind catching her hair and pulling it across her features. And then I walked into your throne room and discovered that I am the one thing in this world that wolves are afraid of. She squeezed his hand. So no, I am not frightened. I am ready. He pulled her against him and held her there, his chin resting on top of her head, and they watched Valdric's army make camp in the fields below. On the 6th morning, Saren woke in Theron's arms and felt their connection pulse between them, strong and golden and ready. Whatever happens today, Theron murmured against her hair. Stay behind me. Saren turned to face him. You know I will not do that. He searched her face, and she watched him struggle with it. The protector in him, warring with the part that knew she was right. Then stay close, he said finally. Always, she replied. The summit convened in the great hall at midday. The throne room had been transformed. The long tables were pushed to the walls. The floor was cleared, forming a wide circular space in the center. 300 Dunmerran wolves filled the seats on one side. 300 Greythorn wolves filled the other. Banners hung from the rafters, and the air was so thick with tension that Saren could taste it on her tongue. Valdric Harkin entered through the main doors, and the room fell silent. He was nothing like Theron. Where Theron was controlled and contained, Valdric was theatrical. He was enormous, wider than any wolf she had seen, with a mane of copper hair and a face built for cruelty. Saren felt the quiet stir in response, eager and sharp. He walked to the center of the floor and stopped. His retinue fanned out behind him. Kalik stood at his shoulder, wearing the same blade-thin smile he had worn the night Saren overheard his plan. King Theron, Valdric said, the sound filling the hall like a drumbeat. I have come to discuss the future of our territories. I believe the current borders serve neither kingdom. I propose a redistribution. You propose conquest dressed in polite language, Theron replied, from the dais. Say what you mean, Valdric. Valdric's smile widened. Very well. I challenge you. For the border territories and for the Quellborn. The word detonated in the silence. Wolves on both sides tensed. Saren, seated beside Theron on the dais, felt every eye in the room turn toward her. The Quellborn is not a piece of territory to be bargained for, Theron said, and his voice carried the cold edge of a man whose patience had ended. She is my bonded mate, my queen, and she is not part of any negotiation. Then prove it, Valdric said, stepping into the challenge ring marked on the floor. If she matters so much, fight for her. Theron rose. The hall erupted in whispers that died the moment he descended the dais steps. He moved into the ring, and the two Alpha Kings faced each other across 15 feet of cleared stone. Saren's heart hammered. Theron reached her through the bond. Calm, focused, lethal. But beneath the control, she could sense the calculation running through his mind. Valdric was larger. Valdric had fought more challenges. Valdric had never lost. The challenge signal sounded. Both kings shifted. The wolves that replaced them were massive. Theron's wolf was black-furred and silver-eyed, sleek and powerful. Valdric's was copper-red and enormous, broader and heavier, built like a battering ram. They collided with an impact that shook the floor. The fight was brutal. Valdric fought like an avalanche, all force and crushing weight. He slammed into Theron, again and again, driving him backward, snapping at his throat. Theron was faster, more precise, but every exchange cost him. Saren could feel the pain through the bond. a bitten shoulder, a gash along his ribs, the exhaustion building in his muscles. Then Valdric did something that made the Dunmerran wolves roar in outrage. Two greythorn wolves near the ring shifted simultaneously and lunged at Theron from behind. An ambush. A cheat so brazen it defied belief. Theron spun to face the new attackers, and Valdric struck from behind. His jaws clamped around Theron's leg, and the sickening impact echoed through the hall. Theron went down. Saren was on her feet before the sound stopped ringing. The bond screamed at her, Theron's pain flooding through her in a blinding wave, and she felt something inside her snap into place with absolute crystalline clarity. She stepped off the dais. The hall went silent. Every wolf in the room turned to stare at the human woman walking calmly into the challenge ring. Valdric's wolf released Theron's leg and turned to face her, teeth bared, his muzzle wet and dark. Saren stopped in the center of the ring and looked directly into the copper wolf's eyes. "You wanted the Quellborn," she said, her voice carrying through the hall with a steadiness that surprised even her. "Here I am." Valdric lunged. Saren raised both hands and released the quiet. Not the panicked, involuntary burst she had produced in this same room months ago. Not the blunt force that had flattened 300 wolves indiscriminately. This was something else entirely. Precise. Devastating. The suppression hit Valdric like a wall. His shift shattered mid-stride. The wolf broke apart, and the man that crashed to the stone floor was gasping, clutching at his own chest, his eyes wide with terror as his wolf was ripped away from him. But it did not stop there. The quiet rolled outward, catching the two greythorn wolves who had ambushed Theron and slamming them back into human form. Then it swept the greythorn side of the hall. One by one, Valdric's wolves lost their animals. The shift was stripped from them like fire, doused with water. They staggered, fell, cried out as the thing that defined them went silent. And through it all, the Dunmerran wolves were untouched. Saren held the selective suppression exactly as she had practiced. Theron's wolf, wounded but standing, remained whole. Every Dunmerran wolf in the hall remained whole. Only Greythorn fell. Valdric crawled to his hands and knees, his expression twisted with disbelief and raw, animal terror. He was just a man now. No wolf, no power, no supernatural strength. Just a man on his knees before a human woman who had taken everything he was. With a gesture, "You cannot do this," he rasped. "I already have," Saren said. She walked toward him, barefoot on the stone. 600 wolves, watching a human woman stand over the most feared Alpha King in living memory. "You came here to conquer," she said, looking down at him. "You came here to take a kingdom and claim a weapon. But I am not a weapon. I am not a prize. I am Saren Mael, Queen of Dunmerran, and you are kneeling in my court." Valdric's mouth opened. No sound came out. Behind her, she heard Theron shift back, heard his sharp intake of breath as his human body absorbed the pain of his wounds. But he was standing, battered but standing. "The challenge is decided." Brennick's voice rang out from the edge of the hall. "Alpha King Valdric Harkin has been defeated." The Dunmerran wolves erupted. The sound crashed over Saren like a wave. 600 voices roaring their fury and their triumph, and through it, she felt Theron's pride blazing like a sun. She released the quiet. Valdric's wolf returned to him, and he doubled over, gasping, broken in a way that had nothing to do with physical injury. His wolves stirred around him, dazed and shaken. "Take your army and leave my kingdom," Theron said, his voice carrying over the noise with the calm authority of a king who had already won. "If you return, she will do worse." Valdric looked up at Saren one last time. Whatever he saw in her face made him flinch. He left. His wolves followed. The doors closed behind them, and the hall erupted, again louder this time, wild and joyful. Wolves, who had expected war, discovering they had been handed peace by the woman, half of them had dismissed as weak. Saren stood in the center of the ring, her hands trembling, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. Then Theron was there, limping, his left leg barely holding his weight, but there. He cupped her face in his hands and pressed his forehead against hers. "You were supposed to stay close," he murmured. "I was close," she replied. "I was exactly where I needed to be." He kissed her. In front of the entire court, in front of his council and his commanders, and 600 wolves, who were still roaring their approval, the Alpha King kissed his human queen, and the hall shook with the sound of it. Months later, Saren stood at the window of the royal chambers and watched the sunrise paint the rooftops of Dunmerran in shades of amber and rose. The kingdom was quiet. The borders were secure. Valdric had retreated to Greythorn and had not been heard from since. The court had adjusted, slowly and grudgingly, to the reality of a human queen. The whispers still followed her through the corridors, but they had changed in nature. Less contempt, more curiosity, less pity, more respect. Orlin continued her research into the Quelborn bloodline, filling journals with notes and theories that she insisted would take a lifetime to fully explore. Brennick remained at Theron's side, as steady and unreadable as ever, though Saren had caught him smiling at her twice in the past month, which she considered a personal victory. And Theron slept. Every night, beside her, deeply and peacefully, his arm draped across her waist, his breathing slow and even. The nightmares that had plagued him before the bond were gone. Not suppressed, not silenced, but genuinely absent, as though the quiet had reached into the dark places inside him and calmed them, the same way it settled his wolf. Saren turned from the window and looked at her husband. He was still asleep, his expression relaxed, in a way she never tired of seeing. The hard lines softened, the weight lifted, at least for these few hours before dawn, when the kingdom's demands had not yet found him. She crossed the room and slid back into bed beside him. His arm found her, immediately pulling her close, without waking. A reflex so deeply ingrained now that it happened regardless of consciousness. Saren pressed her cheek against him and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong and entirely hers. She had walked into this castle, barefoot and trembling, a treaty bride no one expected to survive, and she had brought wolves to their knees and a king to his heart. She closed her eyes and let the morning come.